Good evening. Welcome to Sleepy Stories. Tonight's story is The Little Mermaid, and this is a pop-up adaptation of the classic fairy tale, and this was done by Robert Sabuda. I hope you enjoy it. Far out at sea, the water was as blue as the petals of the prettiest cornflower and as clear as the purest glass. But the water was very deep, deeper than any anchor could have hoped to reach. Down at the very bottom of this deep, dark sea lived the sea people. The most wonderful trees and plants grew there. Down in the deepest spot of all was the castle of the Sea King. The castle walls were built of coral, and the roof was made of shells that opened and closed with the current. The Sea King had been a widower for many years and lived with his beloved mother, who was devoted to her 6 granddaughters, the sea princesses. They were pretty children, but the youngest was the loveliest of them all. Her skin was as delicate as a rose. Her eyes were as dark as the deepest ocean. Nothing pleased the 6 princesses more than to hear about the world of the humans above the sea. Their grandmother told them all that she knew of the ships and the towns and the people and the animals. "When each of you turns 15, grandmother said, you will be allowed to float to the surface of the sea and sit on the rocks in the moonlight where the great ships sail past. You'll even be able to see the forests and the towns in the distance, but you must never approach them." The following year, the eldest of the princesses celebrated her 15th birthday. Before she left on her journey to the surface, she promised to tell her younger sisters everything she would see. The little princesses could barely contain her curiosity to have some of the mysteries of the surface revealed. And just because she could not get close to all these wonderful things, she longed for them ever more. The youngest princess drank it all in. Later that evening, she imagined she could hear the sound of the church bells ringing all the way through the ocean to her. A year later, the second sister was allowed to go up through the water and arrived at the surface just as the sun was setting. Another year had passed, and the third princess went up. She was the boldest and swam all the way up to the wide river that connected to the sea. And she saw green hills and farms and magnificent manors. She came upon a group of children swimming in the water, even though they didn't have tails. But they became afraid and ran away. But she said she would never forget the beautiful green hills and the pretty little children who came to swim in the water, even though they didn't have tails. The fourth sister was not as bold. She stayed far out in the ocean and played as whales spouted water. When the fifth princess arrived at the surface, the sea was as a deep green and large icebergs were floating in it, glittering like diamonds. Later, the sky became overcast, and soon thunder and lightning flashed. Perhaps, like their grandmother had told them, the surface was really dangerous, after all. The littlest mermaid swam right up to the porthole on the side of the ship. She could see a crowd of people through the glass. Among them was a young prince, the handsomest she had ever seen. Soon she discovered that the music and singing was indeed a birthday celebration for him. When the young prince came out onto the deck where the sailors were dancing, hundreds of rockets swirled up into the sky and broke apart into showers of light. She had never seen fireworks before, and she stared amazed. It grew late, but the little mermaid could not take her eyes off the ship or the handsome prince. Soon, the sea became restless and waves rising higher and higher until they were like huge black mountains. The vessel groaned and creaked. Then suddenly its wooden planks burst under the heavy pounding of the sea. The mast snapped into two like a reed, and the ship launched to one side. The little mermaid realized the ship was in grave danger. The sailors began jumping overboard to save themselves from the crumbling ship. She looked for the young prince, and just as the ship was being fully torn apart, she saw him disappear into the depths of the sea. For just a moment she was quite pleased, for she thought he would now live within her world. Then she remembered that human beings could not live underwater, so she dove deeply and found him. By morning the storm had died down, and there was not a trace of the ship. The prince's eyes remained closed. The little mermaid was reminded of the marble statue in her garden, and she smoothed back his hair, wishing that he might live. Soon she saw the mainland and a small bay where the water was still. The little mermaid swam with the prince to the beach and placed him on the warm sunshine, making a pillow for his head with the sand. Bells sounded nearby, so she swam further out from the shore and hid behind a large boulder so she could not be seen. Then she watched, hoping that someone would come to help the poor prince. Soon a young girl came. She seemed frightened for a moment, but then she went to get the other humans for help. The little mermaid saw the prince come back to life, and he smiled at everyone around him. But there was no smile for the little mermaid, because he had no idea that she had rescued him. After he was taken away, she felt some sorrow that tears should have run down her face. But living in a watery world, mermaids could not make tears. She dove into the water and returned to her father's palace. Her sisters asked her what she had seen during her visit to the surface, but she was silent and told them nothing. Often she went back to the spot where she had left the prince, but she never saw him, and so she always returned home filled with ever greater sorrow than before. Her one comfort was sitting in her little garden with her arms around the beautiful marble statue, which was so like the prince. Finally, she could keep the secret to herself no more and told her sisters everything. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses. Holding hands in one row, they rose to the surface and swam to where the prince's lavish palace stood. It was built of stone and had a long flight of marble steps that led straight down to the sea. Now that the little mermaid knew where the prince lived, she went back time and time again, swimming up to the narrow channel to reach the marble balcony of the prince's room. She would silently float and gaze up at the young man who thought he was completely alone in the bright moonlight. The little mermaid grew more and more fond of the human beings. Their world seemed so much larger than hers. If human beings don't drown, the little mermaid asked her grandmother, can they go on living forever? Don't they die, as we do down here in the sea? Yes, yes, replied the old woman. They too must die, but when our life here ends, we merely turn into foam on the water. But human beings have souls that live forever. I would gladly give up all the rest of the years of my life to become a human being for just one day, said the little mermaid. Only if a human loved you with all your heart and soul and took your hand in marriage and pledged to be faithful and true to you for all eternity. But that can never happen. Your fishtail, which we find so beautiful, is shocking to the humans, and they turn away in fear. The little mermaid sighed and looked mournfully at her tail. "We must be satisfied with what we have," the old woman said. Later that evening, all the merfolk gathered in the castle for a celebration. A broad stream flowed through the middle of the ballroom, and in it mermen and mermaids were dancing to their own sweet songs. Their voices were lovelier than any human beings had ever been, and the little mermaid sang more sweetly than anyone else, and the audience nearly wept from the beauty of her voice. For a moment there was joy in her heart, but then her thoughts turned to the world above. She was unable to forget the handsome prince and her great sorrow for lacking the soul that he had. She would give anything to be with him and earn a soul. But who could help her? Her sisters and grandmother were kind and loving, but wanted her to simply accept her fate. It would be impossible to even consider going to her father for advice. The little mermaid slipped out of her father's castle, and while everyone inside was still celebrating, she sat alone in her little garden, pondering her fate. She stared up at the beautiful marble statue, wishing it could speak to her and tell her what to do. A long shadow slowly moved across the statue's face. She looked up and saw a dark figure swimming slowly through the water. The sea witch! The little mermaid was dreadfully afraid and shrank back behind the statue. Then it occurred to her that maybe the sea witch could help her. Everyone said that the old woman could do the most impossible things. Filled with fear and staying far behind, the little mermaid began to follow the witch. After a lengthy journey, she came to a dead place in the sea. There were no flowers growing and no sea grass, only a bare, gray, sandy bottom. The witch approached her house, which was built from the bones of shipwrecked sailors, and the little mermaid drew closer. Suddenly, the old woman whirled around. "I know exactly what you're after," she cackled. "How stupid of you. You want to get rid of your tail and replace it with stumps to walk on like human beings, so that the young prince will fall in love with you and you can win a soul." The witch let out such a loud, repulsive laugh that the little mermaid covered her ears. "I shall prepare a drink, and you will swim to land with it before sunrise and swallow it. Your tail will split in two and shrink into human legs, but it will hurt. Oh my, yes, it will feel like a sharp sword passing through you. All who see you will say that you are the loveliest human being they've ever seen, and you will keep your graceful movements. But every step taken will make you feel as if you are walking on knives sharp enough to make your feet bleed. If you're willing to endure all of this, then I can help you." "Yes," said the trembling little mermaid. "Think about it carefully," croaked the witch. "Once you take on the form of a human, you can never be a mermaid again. And the only way to get a soul is to win the prince's love. He must always have you in his thoughts and make you his wife. If the prince marries someone else, the very next morning your heart will break and you will become foam on the cresting waves." "I'm ready," said the little mermaid, turning as pale as death. "But you have to pay me," said the witch. "You're not getting my help for nothing. You have the loveliest voice of anyone who dwells in the sea. You probably think you can charm the prince with your sweet, delicate voice. Well, now you have to give it to me. I demand your greatest possession as payment for the potion." "But he'll take away my voice," said the little mermaid. "What will I have left?" "Well, your lovely figure," said the witch, "your graceful movements, and your expressive eyes. With those eyes you can easily enchant a human heart. Where's your courage?" "So be it," said the little mermaid. And the witch swam over to a large pot and began making the potion. She opened bottle after bottle of strange ingredients and began pouring them into the pot, which soon began to bubble and glow. Each time the witch added something new to the pot, it shook more and grew brighter. The sea witch's terrible laughter echoed all around. Soon the pot was shaking so much that it seemed to explode with a blinding flash of light. When the little mermaid's eyes opened, the sea witch's hideous face was so close to her own that she cried out. But she realized that she could not cry out. Her hands flew to her throat, and she tried again to make a sound, but nothing. Her voice was gone. "Everything has its price," whispered the witch as she held the bottle of poison. The little mermaid returned briefly to her father's palace, where everyone was still sleeping, her heart filled with trepidation, and she silently said goodbye to her beloved family, and then quickly made her way through the dark blue waters to the surface. The sun had not yet risen when she caught sight of the prince's palace, and she swam up to the beautiful marble stairs. The little mermaid drank the sharp, burning potion, and it instantly felt as if her body was being split into two. She fainted, collapsing on the steps. When she opened her eyes, she was staring into the face of the handsome prince. He looked at her so earnestly that she gazed down shyly and realized her tail was gone, replaced by human legs. The prince asked who she was and how she had come to be there, but she could only look at him, sadly, because she could not speak. He took her by the hand and led her to the palace. As the witch had predicted, each step felt like she was walking on knives, but she willingly endured it, walking as lightly as a bubble alongside the prince, who marveled at her graceful movements. She was soon given expensive dresses made of silk and quickly became the most beautiful creature in the palace, even though she could not speak or sing. During royal banquets, graceful girls dressed in exotic costumes would dance before the prince and his court. One even sang beautifully, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. This made the little mermaid sad, for she knew that she herself could sing far more beautifully. "If only he knew that I gave my voice away forever to be with him," she thought. The girls continued their dancing, so the little mermaid raised her lovely arms, stood on the tips of her toes, and glided across the floor, dancing as no one had danced before. She looked more beautiful with every step, and everyone was enchanted, especially the prince. She kept dancing even though she felt if she were treading on knives. The prince said she must never leave him, and the little mermaid's heart nearly burst with joy. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, she would go out on the broad marble steps and cool her burning feet in the cold sea water. Sometimes her sisters would swim up to the steps and tell her how unhappy they were that she was gone. Another time she saw her father and grandmother in the distance. Both of them were beckoning for her to return, but she could not leave. Her love for the prince was too strong now. With time, she became more precious to the prince, but while he loved her, he had no intention of making her his princess. Yet he would have to marry her, or she would never receive a soul, and on the morning after his wedding to another, she would dissolve into foam on the sea. But he didn't know that. "You remind me of a girl I once met," said the prince. "I was in a shipwreck, and the waves cast me ashore. She found me on the beach and saved my life. She's the only one in the world that I could ever love. I never saw her again, but you look so much like her." The little mermaid could only smile, knowing that it was she and not the waves that brought him to the beach. Not long after, there was talk that the prince would marry this beautiful daughter of a neighboring king. The prince's magnificent new ship was prepared for the journey, was filled to capacity with the royal court. Of course, the little mermaid was among them. "I really must go," he told her. "It's time for me to be married. But I could never love her as much as I loved that girl on the beach whom you resemble. I would rather choose you." The ship set sail, and that night, when everyone was asleep but the helmsman at the wheel, the little mermaid sat by the ship's rail. Her sisters came up through the waves and looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. She waved at them and smiled, wishing she could tell them that she was happy and that all was going well. Soon the prince would make her his wife, and she would receive her very own soul. The next morning the ship sailed into the harbor of the neighboring king's capital. Church bells rang, trumpets blared, and the soldiers saluted the prince's arrival. When the princess appeared, the little mermaid was amazed by her beauty and the fact that they looked very similar to each other. The princess had long dark hair, dark eyes, and graceful movements. "It's you," whispered the prince. "You're the one who rescued me when I was on the beach." "Oh, I'm so very happy," he said, and turned to the little mermaid. "I've found her, and my greatest wish, more than ever, that I've ever hoped for, has been granted." The little mermaid felt her heart breaking, for she knew the day of his marriage would also mean the day of her death. At the wedding, the little mermaid stood holding the bride's train, listening but not hearing the words being spoken. As the prince and princess were joined as husband and wife, she was thinking about how her last night on earth and about everything that she had lost in the world. The same evening, the bride and groom and all the guests went on board the ship. The cannon roared and the flags waved. In the center of the ship was a glorious tent that had been raised. The sails filled with the breeze, and the ship glided lightly over the clear seas. When it grew dark, colored lanterns were lit and everyone began dancing on deck. The little mermaid could not help thinking of the first time she had come up from the sea and gazed on such joyous festivities like this. So she joined the dance for one last time, swerving and swooping as lightly as a sparrow. She had never danced so elegantly before. Her feet blazed with pain, but she felt nothing, for the wound in her heart was far more painful. She knew this was the last night she would ever see the prince, for whom she had given up her family, her home, even her lovely voice. This was the last night she would breathe the air with him, or gaze on the deep sea with starry sky. An eternal night without thoughts or dreams awaited her. Long past midnight, when all had gone contentedly to bed, the little mermaid remained awake and looked to the east for a sign of the coming dawn. The first ray of sun, she knew, would bring her death. Suddenly she saw her sisters rising out of the sea, but something was wrong. Their long, beautiful hair was no longer waving in the wind. It had been cut off. "We have given our hair to the sea witch," they said, "to help us save you from your death. She has given us the knife that you must plunge into the prince's heart before he wakes. When his blood splashes on your feet, they'll grow back to the form of a tail, and you'll be a mermaid once more. But hurry, in a few moments the sun will rise." She took the knife, and her sisters sank back into the sea. The ship was completely silent as the little mermaid made her way to where the prince and princess were sleeping. She drew back the bed curtains and saw the lovely bride sleeping with her head on the prince's chest. She bent down and kissed his handsome brow, then looked through the open window to the sky where the rosy dawn was growing brighter and brighter. The little mermaid's hands trembled as she held the knife. She could barely breathe. She was shaking so much. She thought that her own death would surely be better than this. She stood, turned to the window, and hurled the knife as hard as she could, far out into the waves. With a last glance at the prince, from eyes half dimmed with death, she ran out of the deck and threw herself into the sea, instantly dissolving into white foam. The sea was calm and the sun rose. Its warm and gentle rays fell on the white foam, and the little mermaid did not feel as if she was dying. She could see the bright sun, and hovering around her were hundreds of lovely creatures. She could actually see right through them, see the white sails of the ship and clouds in the sky. The little creatures' voices were the voices of song, yet too otherworldly to be heard by human ears. They had no wings, but their lightness carried them up as they floated through the air. The little mermaid saw that she had a body like theirs, and she was rising higher and higher out of the white foam. "Where am I?" she asked, and her voice sounded like the other beings, more ethereal than any earthly musical sound could. "Among the daughters of the air," answered the others. "A mermaid does not have a soul, and she can never have one unless she wins the full love of a human being. Eternity for her depends on a power outside of her. Nor do the daughters of the air have an everlasting soul, but through the good deeds they can earn one for themselves. You, poor little mermaid, have tried with your whole heart to do as we were doing. You have suffered and endured and have raised yourself into the world of the spirits of the air. Now, with good deeds, you too can earn yourself an everlasting soul. The little mermaid flew down into the ship and, unseen, kissed the forehead of the bride and smiled at the prince. She raised her arms toward the heavenly sun, and for the first time she knew what tears felt like. Then she mounted a cloud and was sailing to the sky with the other children of the air. The end. Good night.